The South China Sea does not have a neutral corner. Every navigable passage, every sandbar with a runway on it, every stretch of international water between the Philippine archipelago and the Paracel Islands exists inside a web of overlapping claims, contested boundaries, and calculated ambiguities that have been accumulating since before any of the hardware currently operating in the region was built. When two carrier strike groups occupy the same body of water on opposite sides of a maritime boundary that one of them does not recognize. The situation is not technically a conflict. It is a geometry problem. And geometry problems in the South China Sea have a way of resolving themselves in ways that are both entirely foreseeable and entirely surprising at the same time. The foreseeable element of what happened on a Friday morning in the central South China Sea was this. A People's Liberation Army Navy carrier strike group had been conducting what Beijing's official communications described as routine maritime exercises in the region for 11 days. The strike group was operating within what China's domestic law designated as its exclusive economic zone, on the western side of the median line that separates Chinese and Philippine maritime claims. A line that the United States formally declined to recognize as a boundary for military navigation purposes. The U.S. Navy Carrier Strike Group was operating 43 nautical miles to the east, on the international waters side of that line, conducting its own exercises in the same body of water. For 11 days, both strike groups had maintained professional separation. The communication channels between them were open and functional. The agreed maritime safety protocols, the code for unplanned encounters at sea, designed precisely for this kind of close proximity bilateral tension, were being observed. The picture was controlled. It was managed. It was the kind of managed tension that generations of naval officers on both sides had developed the skills and the institutional patience to sustain. The surprising element was what the Chinese strike group was actually doing during those 11 days. The drone program that the PLA Navy had been developing for 9 years had reached a capability threshold that no Western assessment had projected it would reach for at least 3 more. The assessment had been based on the observable development timeline, on the engineering challenges of coordinating large numbers of autonomous aerial systems in a contested electromagnetic environment, and on the reasonable inference that the coordination architecture required for a 400-unit autonomous swarm would need several additional years of integration testing before it could be considered operationally reliable. The assessment had been careful. It had been analytical. It had been wrong by approximately 36 months. What the PLA Navy's carrier had been loading into its flight deck and hangar spaces for 4 days before the incident, under the cover of what appeared on overhead satellite imagery as standard flight operations and maintenance cycles, was not a conventional aircraft complement. The standard fixed-wing and rotary-wing aircraft were present and accounted for. What was also present in the lower hangar levels that satellite imagery could not directly observe was a complement of 212 autonomous one-way attack drones. Small, commercially derived airframes modified with military-grade navigation and targeting systems. Each one individually unremarkable, collectively constituting a weapons system for which the U.S. Navy's tactical doctrine had not yet written the response playbook. The plan was not to use the drones as a primary attack system. The plan was to use them as a wall. PLA. Tactical planners had spent 7 years studying the engagement geometry of the Aegis combat system under saturation conditions. Studying not just the published technical specifications, but the operational patterns, the engagement sequencing, the radar resource allocation behavior that the system exhibited when it was simultaneously tracking a large number of diverse airborne contacts across multiple threat axes. Their modeling had identified a specific cognitive and computational loading threshold at which the Aegis system's engagement prioritization algorithms began to produce suboptimal sequencing. Not failures, not shutdowns, but a measurable degradation in the speed at which the system cycled from detection to classification to engagement authorization. When the track count exceeded a certain density in a specific angular sector, 200 drones, launched simultaneously from the carrier's deck and from the surface vessels of its screen, would create a track density in the northern sector of the U.S. Strike Group's defensive picture that would push the Aegis engagement prioritization into exactly that degradation band. Not overwhelm it, not blind it, simply slow it. By a margin measured in seconds, but seconds that, in the engagement timeline of a supersonic anti-ship missile, were the difference between an intercept and an impact. While the Aegis systems on the U.S. destroyers were processing and prioritizing 212 drone contacts in the northern sector, 6 EA-18 anti-ship cruise missiles would launch from the PLA Navy surface combatants and take a southern routing. A low-altitude, sea-skimming approach that used the curvature of the Earth and the radar horizon geometry to stay below the detection threshold for as long as possible, while the defending system's attention was committed to the drone mass in the north. The missiles would appear on the radar picture from the south at a range that, combined with the engagement resource loading from the drone swarm, would leave the Aegis system with a compressed intercept window that the PLA modeling assessed as insufficient for a complete defensive solution. The concept was elegant. It was thoroughly modeled. It represented a genuine evolution in anti-access area denial doctrine, a shift from simple saturation to cognitive and computational exploitation. It was the kind of operational concept that demanded professional acknowledgement, even in the context of its complete failure to achieve anything. The failure began 31 days before the drones left the deck. A national security agency signals collection platform had been monitoring the encrypted data traffic between the PLA Navy carrier and its associated shore-based command infrastructure throughout the 11-day exercise period. The volume and pattern of that traffic had been within the expected parameters for a carrier conducting routine exercises for the first 8 days. On day 9, the traffic pattern changed. The change was subtle. A 12% increase in data volume on a specific subnet that the signals analysis team associated with logistics and payload management systems, occurring at a time of day that did not correspond to the standard maintenance cycle communication windows the PLA carrier had established over the preceding 8 days. The anomaly was flagged at 11:15 p.m. by an automated traffic analysis system and placed in the review queue. An analyst working the overnight watch reached it at 1:47 a.m. She ran a comparative analysis against the baseline traffic profile established over the first 8 days. The 12% volume increase on the logistics subnet was accompanied by a specific change in the packet size distribution. A shift toward larger data packets, consistent with the transfer of configuration files rather than operational status messages. Configuration files on the logistics and payload management subnet. At 11 p.m., she filed a Priority 1 intelligence report at 2:14 a.m. The report described a possible reconfiguration of the PLA carrier's payload management system, inconsistent with standard exercise operations, and requested enhanced collection coverage on the carrier's hangar deck thermal signature and its surface combatants' weapon system activity indicators. By 6 a.m., the enhanced collection was underway. By 10:30 a.m., thermal imaging of the carrier's hangar deck, taken from an oblique angle by a reconnaissance asset whose approach the carrier's own tracking systems would interpret as routine airspace transit, showed a heat signature distribution in the lower hangar that was inconsistent with conventional aircraft storage. The thermal footprint was too regular, too dense, too uniform. Conventional aircraft, even when stowed efficiently, produce a thermal pattern characterized by the uneven heat signatures of engines, avionics bays, and fuel systems in different states of preparation. The pattern in the lower hangar showed 212 nearly identical thermal sources at uniform spacing. The assessment reached Pacific Fleet at 11:45 a.m. The PLA carrier was carrying a large autonomous drone complement in its lower hangar. The quantity, based on thermal source count, was estimated at between 180 and 230 individual units. The assessment concluded with a tactical implication that required no elaboration for anyone who had read the PLA drone doctrine documents that had been circulating in the intelligence community for 3 years. The Pacific Fleet Commander authorized a defensive reconfiguration at 12:30 p.m. The reconfiguration had to be invisible. Any change in the U.S. strike group's observable posture that the PLA monitoring assessed as a reaction to their drone complement would reveal that the complement had been detected, which would either abort the operation or cause a tactical adjustment that might produce a less predictable threat geometry. The solution was to change nothing observable and everything functional. The Aegis systems on the 4 Burke-class destroyers in the U.S. strike group's screen were reprogrammed overnight with a modified engagement prioritization algorithm specifically developed and held in reserve for the autonomous swarm scenario. The algorithm had existed in a classified development state for 2 years, validated by exercises but never operationally deployed. It worked differently from the standard Aegis engagement sequencing in one critical respect. It treated a dense cluster of small, slow-moving airborne contacts on a single approach azimuth not as individual threat tracks requiring individual engagement solutions, but as a single composite threat object with a single composite engagement priority. And it automatically reserved a specified percentage of the radar tracking and engagement resources for other sectors regardless of the contact density in the primary threat axis. The algorithm was designed precisely to prevent the cognitive and computational loading effect that the PLA doctrine was counting on. It had been sitting in a development archive waiting for this scenario for 24 months. Additionally, 3 EA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft were positioned aboard a land-based airfield within range of the operating area, assigned to an immediate alert posture that could put them airborne in 11 minutes. Their tasking, in the event of a drone launch, was not the drones. Their tasking was the 6 YJ-18 missiles. Specifically, the data link frequencies that the YJ-18's terminal guidance system used for mid-course updates, frequencies that the Growler's jamming systems had been specifically programmed to target based on signals intelligence collection from previous PLA live-fire exercises. An Ohio-class guided missile submarine had been operating in the South China Sea for 16 days. Its presence was not acknowledged. It carried Tomahawk cruise missiles and had been assigned a pre-planned strike package against the PLA surface combatants' weapons systems if a hostile launch was confirmed. The strike package was designed to be executed within 90 seconds of authorization. The submarine was positioned and waiting. At 4:33 a.m. on the Friday morning, the PLA carrier began its drone launch cycle. The sequence was rapid and professionally executed, a product of clearly extensive rehearsal. The drones left the carrier's deck in coordinated waves, climbing to their assigned altitudes and fanning out across the northern sector. The surface combatants launched additional drones simultaneously from their own platforms. The full swarm of 212 units was airborne and in formation within 4 minutes and 17 seconds. On the radar displays of the U.S. destroyers, 212 new contact tracks appeared in the northern sector simultaneously. Under the standard engagement prioritization algorithm, this contact density would have consumed the majority of available tracking resources within seconds and begun producing the sequencing degradation the PLA planners had modeled. Under the modified algorithm, loaded overnight, invisible to any external observer, the contact cluster was classified as a composite object, assigned a unified threat priority, and the remaining tracking resources were immediately and automatically redistributed to maintain full coverage of all other sectors. The southern sector remained fully covered. At 4:37 a.m., the 6 YJ-18 missiles launched from the PLA surface combatants on a southern routing. They appeared on the radar at 4:41 a.m. at a range of 41 nautical miles, sea skimming at an altitude of 15 feet, approaching from a bearing that the standard engagement picture would have had insufficient resources to fully prosecute while simultaneously managing the northern drone swarm. The southern sector engagement had full radar resources and a pre-computed intercept solution that had been running on the modified algorithm's reserved processing capacity since the drone launch was first detected. The SM-6 launches began at 4:41 a.m. and 34 seconds. Simultaneously, the 3 Growlers, airborne since 4:29 a.m., which was 2 minutes after the drone launch cycle began and the alert condition was confirmed, activated their full-spectrum jamming against the YJ-18 data link frequencies. 5 of the 6 missiles lost their mid-course update feeds within 4.2 seconds of jamming activation. Their guidance systems reverted to inertial navigation. The inertial solutions, computed at launch against the U.S. carrier's position at that moment, did not account for the carrier's course change. A 14-degree turn to the northeast that had been executed at 4:38 a.m. as a standard anti-missile maneuvering protocol, and had moved the ship 2 nautical miles from its launch point position by the time the missiles reached the terminal phase. 5 missiles, running on stale inertial solutions, arrived at the coordinates of where the carrier had been rather than where it was. 3 of the 5 were intercepted by SM-6 before reaching those coordinates anyway. 2 flew through empty water. The 6th missile retained partial data link connectivity. One of its update channels had been operating on a frequency variant that the Growler's preloaded jamming profile had not covered. It continued to receive degraded targeting updates and maintained approximate track on the carrier's true position. It was engaged by SM-6 at a range of 9 nautical miles. The intercept was a proximity detonation at 7 nautical miles. The warhead did not achieve a lethal effect at that range. The missile's airframe was structurally compromised, and it impacted the water at 6 nautical miles, generating a debris field that the carrier's radar tracked for 40 seconds before the surface picture cleared. 6 nautical miles. In the CIC of the carrier, the watch team processed the engagement assessment with the systematic efficiency of people who had been awake for 4 hours, working a threat picture they had known was coming. The tactical action officer reviewed the track data on the 6th missile, the one that had retained partial guidance, and noted in her log that the frequency variant had not been in the Growler jamming profile. That note would reach the EW programming team within 6 hours and would result in a profile update distributed to every Growler crew in the Pacific Fleet within 48 hours. The drone swarm, meanwhile, had continued its approach. 212 drones, operating autonomously, had not received any signal that their supporting strike had failed. Their programming did not include a mission abort condition tied to the strike missile's performance. They had been sent, and they continued toward their assigned terminal coordinates. The modified Aegis algorithm had been tracking them as a composite object since their launch. When the swarm reached the engagement threshold, the range at which its individual units began to constitute a terminal threat to the strike group. The algorithm released engagement authority to the point defense systems and simultaneously tasked the Growlers, now transitioning from anti-missile jamming, to activate their drone band disruption capability. The Growler disruption package targeted the autonomous navigation and coordination frequencies the drone swarm used for formation coherence. Without formation coherence signals, the individual drones reverted to their last programmed heading, a heading that pointed them toward the U.S. carrier's position as of the moment the coordination signal was lost. Formation coherence was lost at 4:44 a.m. across most of the swarm simultaneously. Individual drones began diverging from their coordinated approach geometry. Clusters collided. Single units flew on individually, losing the mutual coverage geometry that made the swarm dangerous as an integrated system. The composite threat object fragmented into 212 individual small airframes, flying on divergent headings without coordination. The point defense engagement of the fragmented swarm was methodical and complete. The destroyer's rolling airframe missile systems handled the outer boundary. The CIWS mounts handled the inner boundary. The engagement lasted 11 minutes and 14 seconds. Not one of the 212 drones reached the carrier. At 4:57 a.m., the last drone was removed from the engagement picture. At 5:03 a.m., the Ohio-class submarine received the strike authorization it had been holding since 4:37 a.m. The authorization had been withheld while the missile and drone engagements were prosecuted. The submarine strike package was reserved for the scenario in which the missile defense failed, and further PLA offensive action appeared imminent. With all 6 missiles either intercepted or expended and the drone swarm eliminated, the authorization was modified. The submarine would not execute its Tomahawk strike package. The situation was resolved. Escalation beyond the defensive engagement was not authorized. The submarine acknowledged and maintained position. The PLA carrier strike group did not launch additional aircraft or weapons following the engagement. The communication channels between the two strike groups remained open throughout. No formal acknowledgement of the engagement was transmitted on those channels. Both strike groups continued their exercises. At 6:15 a.m., the U.S. Corps carrier resumed standard flight operations. The morning's first aircraft launched at 6:22 a.m. At 9:30 a.m., the Pacific Fleet Intelligence Team completed its initial battle damage assessment. The assessment noted that the modified Aegis engagement prioritization algorithm had functioned within modeled parameters, that the Growler frequency variant gap had been identified and would be corrected, and that the PLA drone swarm coordination architecture was more sophisticated than any previous assessment had credited. A finding that required an immediate update to 6 separate threat assessment documents. At 11 a.m., a diplomatic communication was transmitted through established back channels between the U.S. and Chinese defense establishments. The content of that communication was classified. Its existence was noted in the operational log. At 11:45 a.m., the PLA carrier strike group altered course to the northwest and began increasing the separation distance between the two groups. By sunset, the separation had grown to 112 nautical miles. Now the accounting. 212 autonomous drones launched in coordinated swarm formation. 212 drones removed from the engagement picture through Growler coordination disruption and point defense engagement. 6 EA-18 anti-ship cruise missiles launched on southern routing. 3 intercepted by SM-6. 2 impacted empty water due to inertial navigation error against a carrier that had maneuvered. 1 engaged at 9 nautical miles by SM-6 proximity detonation, impacting water at 6 nautical miles. 0 missiles reached the carrier. 0 U.S. ships struck. 0 U.S. casualties. 1 modified engagement prioritization algorithm that had been waiting in a development archive for 24 months. 1 frequency variant that the Growler profile had not covered. Corrected within 48 hours. 1 signals analyst working an overnight shift who found a 12% traffic anomaly at 1:47 a.m. and decided it was worth a priority 1 report. The PLA operational concept had been genuine, sophisticated, and built on a rigorous analysis of the Aegis system's behavior under specific loading conditions. The analysis was accurate. The loading threshold they had identified was real. The degradation their modeling predicted would have occurred under the standard algorithm. Would have occurred, and the engagement outcome might have been different. The concept failed not because it was poorly designed, but because the condition it depended on, the standard algorithm being active, had been removed 31 days before the drones left the deck by an analyst who thought a 12% traffic increase on a logistics subnet at 11 o'clock at night was worth investigating. In the competition between autonomous swarm doctrine and the systems designed to defeat it, the decisive variable on this morning was not the drone count or the missile routing or the sophistication of the coordination architecture. It was a data packet size distribution at 11 p.m. that was slightly larger than it should have been. Noticed by someone whose job was to notice things that were slightly wrong. Who noticed it and filed a report instead of attributing it to routine variation. Every swarm needs a signal to stay coherent. Remove the signal, and 212 weapons become 212 separate problems. Each one manageable, none of them decisive. The sea off the Philippine archipelago remembers every approach vector. It has no record of any of them arriving where they were aimed. That is the standard. That is what it costs to hold the line in contested water.